Okay, so I want to talk about David and Goliath today in the sermon, today and next Sunday as well, Lord willing. This is going to be interesting. We won't really get to the lessons part in this sermon. Usually what I would have been doing is going through God's different people back through time, and we would see that the trials that they had and how God saved them out of them, and then we would look at the deliverance that they experienced, and then we would look at some practical lessons that we can learn from that. And I won't really get to many practical lessons today, but next time, Lord willing, we will. But there's going to be some interesting facts here that I have to bring out about this account of David and Goliath that I think you'll find fascinating. At least I did. So everybody knows the story, I'm sure, of David and Goliath. Goliath was this giant. He was a champion of the Philistines, and he was a thorn in Israel's side. They were going to battle against the Philistines. If you turn with me to 1 Samuel 17 and verse 4. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 4. They're battling with the Philistines, and the Philistines have this Goliath, this giant, and he keeps coming out every day and mocking the Israelites and defying the God of Israel. And, of course, nobody wants to fight him because the man was huge. And then, of course, David ends up killing him, but we won't get to that even today. So Goliath was the champion of the Philistines. He was 6 cubits and a span tall. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 4. It says, "And there went out a champion of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." Now, a cubit is the part of the arm from the elbow downward, the forearm, an ancient measure of length derived from the forearm, varying at different times and places, but usually about 18 to 22 inches. I just measured my forearm last night because I was curious how long it was, and mine is 17.5 inches, so just slightly shorter than the 18, the average. But I'm a fairly small guy, so you take a guy that's 6 foot or over 6 foot, I'm sure his cubit would be 18, 20 inches or so. And then it said that he was 6 cubits in a span. Now we'll get into, I'm defining these terms first, and then we'll see how tall the guy actually was. A span is the distance from the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger, or sometimes to the tip of the forefinger when the hand is fully extended. The space equivalent to this taken as a measure of length, averaging 9 inches. So right here is a span from the thumb to the pinky finger. And I also measured that, trying to get to the 9 inches, but only 8.25 in my case. I mean, I stretched that thing out as far as it would possibly go, 8.25. But I don't have very big hands, so you take the average guy, or bigger hands, I'm sure 9 inches is about right. So if you use the 18-inch cubit and the 9-inch span, Goliath would have been 9 feet 9 inches tall, which is, well, think how tall a basketball rim is when you play basketball. That's 10 feet tall, right? So Goliath would have stood underneath the rim of the basketball thing, and he would have only been 3 inches from having his head touch the rim. So he could just walk up and do this to dunk, right? Pretty tall. Now, if you use a 22-inch cubit in the 9-inch span, Goliath would have been 11 feet 9 inches tall. So that's enormous. I mean, you think, I don't even know how tall this is. Probably a 9-foot ceiling here, I suppose, maybe 8 or 9 feet, 8 feet. So Goliath would have been walking around like this if he was 9 foot 9, and if he was 11 feet, he would have probably had to get on his hands and knees almost to crawl through this room so he wouldn't be hitting his head on the ceiling. He actually is not the biggest man in the Bible, though. Og, this man Og, king of Bashan, and you can read about him, and we won't go back there in the interest of time, but in Deuteronomy 3:11, it talks about the bedstead, or the bed, of this king named Og. And when you do the math, like I did with Goliath, Og would have been between 13 and a half and 16 and a half feet assuming he would have taken up the bed. I don't know why you'd make a 16.5-foot bed for a guy that was only 6 feet tall or something. So I assume that he was somewhere around that height, which was absolutely enormous. Now, just to give you something to compare it to, the tallest man in medical history was a young man by the name of Robert Perishing Wadlow, and he was 8 feet 11.1 inches tall, almost 9 feet. He lived in the 1940s. I think he died in 1943. I can't remember. I read about him. This has been a while ago, though. He was only in his early 20s when he died. He had a disorder, I forget what it's called, but your pituitary gland never stops putting out the chemicals to tell your body to keep growing, essentially, is how I understand it. And nowadays, they can give you medicine to stop that. So you don't typically see these people that are 9 feet tall today, although we would have some of them if they didn't give the pituitary blocker things to people like that. But they didn't have that back in the 40s. And so this guy just kept growing. If he wouldn't have died at, I think it was 23, who knows? He could have been 12 or 15 feet tall until he finally died of something, I suppose, because he would have never stopped growing. Just as a little kid, he was taller than his dad. I mean, like a little boy, like 5-year-old kid, he was as tall as his dad. Anyway, he died of an infection because he had some leg braces on. Because a lot of people, when they get that big, they have problems, right? They're just not, stuff just isn't right. And anyway, he had this leg brace on, and it wore through his skin down, I think, on his heel, and he got an infection, and he died of the infection within a week or something like that. But I put some pictures here in the outline, just so you can see. So here's a guy, and I'm assuming that he was about at his peak height there, shortly before he died in these pictures, at 8 foot 11. And you see the one with him standing next to those women. Those are adult, average-sized women, and they're basically about waist height on him. So, I mean, these women, the tops of their heads are like this high, like waist height on this guy. And then the other picture, here's a couple of men, and they're not much more than waist height on this guy. So, I mean, this is how huge he was. He was absolutely enormous. But he was a lot shorter, well, not a lot, but he was a good, 10 inches shorter than Goliath would have been, at best, or maybe 2 foot 10 inches shorter, depending on which cubit you use. So Goliath would have been approximately 1 to 3 feet taller than Wadlow, and Goliath would have been about 4 to 6 feet taller than David if David was of average height. If David would have been 5'9", Goliath would have been 4 feet taller than him at 9'9", and if David was 5'9", Goliath would have been 6 feet taller than David at 11 foot 9. So if you think about it, like proportionally, and I don't know if this is exactly right, but imagine me or somebody even taller than me standing next to Braden, right? That would be David versus Goliath. Somebody that's 6 feet tall standing next to Braden probably. Now, you can imagine if I said, hey, Braden, come on, let's tussle. And he comes up, and unless I'm just going to let him win, right, there's no way that Braden, at his size and age, would be able to take me down, not unless he had a gun or something like that. Now, give him 10 years, and I wouldn't want to wrestle with him anymore. I'm sure he'd be able to beat the soup out of me. But at that age, you see, I mean, that's kind of the comparison, right? Little kid, great big guy. That was David versus Goliath. David didn't have a chance, obviously, naturally speaking. I mean, he'd have been looking up at this guy that was, literally could be twice as tall as David was. But not only was Goliath huge, he was also well armed. Look at verse 5. It says, and he had an helmet of brass upon his head. So he's got this helmet of brass, which I'm sure that was super comfortable to wear. I can just imagine putting this big, heavy metal helmet on your head without the modern advent of foam and padding and things like that. But, for a guy like Goliath, he probably didn't even feel it, I suppose. And then he was also armed with a coat of mail that weighed 5,000 shekels of brass. The rest of that verse says, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Now, we have to know how heavy a shekel is to understand how heavy this coat of mail was. I think everybody know what a coat of mail is. It's like it's a metal coat, and it's like woven metal, like real thin little pieces of metal woven together. Instead of fabric, it would be metal. would stop sword piercings and arrows and things like that. So a shekel, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is 1/60th of a mina, which is equivalent to 1 pound. That is, a mina is equivalent to 1 pound. So therefore, a shekel would be 1/60th of a pound. I'll give you the definition here. Shekel is an ancient unit of weight of the Babylonians, and hence of the Phoenicians, Hebrews, and others, equal to 1/60th of a mina. A mina is a unit of weight anciently used in Western Asia, Greece, and Egypt. And then it says, in Greek-speaking countries, it contained 100 drachmas. It varied according to locality and time, but was not far from 1 pound. And I've tried to pronounce that word a million times before I got here, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I don't know if it's French, and it would be avoirdupois or something. I don't know. But anyway, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm not even going to try. But it's Avoirdupois. So all the people that are hooked on phonics, you can explain how to pronounce that after the sermon. But basically what that means is the standard American pound. I looked up that word, which I can't pronounce, and it means a standard American pound. So you have a mina equaling a standard American pound, in other words, and a shekel is 1/60th of a mina, or 1/60th of a pound. So when you do the math, Goliath's coat of mail weighed approximately 83.33 pounds. Now that's pretty heavy, right? I mean, you throw 83 pounds on your back, that would weight a guy down for sure. But there's a little bit of discrepancy on how much a shekel weighed also. If you go to Unger's Bible Dictionary, the shekel is said to weigh 10 pennyweights in English. And this is from Unger's article called Metrology, and then section 3 in part 1 on the shekel. So a shekel is 10 pennyweights. That probably doesn't do us much good because none of us know what a pennyweight is, I doubt. But according to Wikipedia, a pennyweight is 0.054857 standard ounces. There's that word again that I can't pronounce. But in standard American ounces. I'm sure all of you knew that. I didn't know that. I had to look it up. I'm sure you had that off the top of your heads. So using that definition of a shekel, Goliath's coat of mail weighed approximately 171.43 pounds. Now that's a lot of weight. That would be like if I threw a 20-pound rucksack on my back and then jumped on your back. That's 171 pounds, basically. You know, that you start walking around with 171 pounds on you, you understand just how big that coat of mail was. It was huge because Goliath was huge and it was heavy. So depending on the weight of the shekel, like I said, Goliath's coat of mail weighed between 83 and 171 pounds. So needless to say, he was a very large and a very heavily armored man. But he also had some other armor. He had some greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders, there in verse 6. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders. A greave is armor for the leg below the knee. So when you see these artists' renditions of Goliath, you usually see him having these metal things, like, what do they call it when you play soccer? The shin covers, I forget what they call those things. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about when kids that play soccer, they got the shin coverings. It's like that, only metal. And then he had a target of brass between his shoulders. A target is a light, round shield or buckler, a small targe. Now when it says between his shoulders, I'm assuming it was on his chest. Because a lot of times when we think about between your shoulders, I think of like on the back, like between your shoulder blades. But your shoulders are on the front of your body too, not just the back of your body. So I'm assuming that the target was probably on his chest. Maybe he had one on his back too, I don't know. Although I don't see Goliath running away from battle and needing a target on his back, so it was probably on his chest, I suppose. So he's well armed and protected. He also had an offensive weapon. He had a spear, quite the large spear. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, in verse 7, 1 Samuel 17:7. It says, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and we'll get to his spear head next. I won't finish that verse right now. So the staff is, the long handle part of the spear. And it said it's like a weaver's beam. Now, of course, none of us, I shouldn't say none of us, but probably most of you don't even know what a weaver's beam is. Probably most of us wouldn't even know what a weaver is, haven't seen something like that, because that stuff's made in factories somewhere and nobody does weaving anymore. But in Israel's day, that would have been common to everybody, because everybody did their own weaving in those days, or a lot of people did. And the weaver's beam was this big beam on the top of the loom. This is from International Standard Bible Encyclopedia on the beam. A beam is a part of a loom used in comparison to indicate the great size of the spears carried by the enemy soldiers who were defeated by the heroes of Israel. And then they give several different scripture references there. So when it said that it's like a weaver's beam, it's talking about this long rod that was part of the loom, just to give the people of that day an idea of, we're talking about a big, long spear. So Goliath's spear was huge. It's been estimated to have been over 12 feet long. That's a long spear. That would be from like me to Wayne long. That's probably about 12 feet or so. So you're talking about a big, big spear. A spear probably the size of, those guys when they joust, they get on the horse and they run at each other and they got this great big long thing. His spear would have probably been like one of those things, great big huge long thing. Now, these people here have estimated how big his spear would have been based on the weight of the spear head, which we'll get to in a minute, and then based on the weaver's beam and having, if you have a spearhead that weighs a certain amount, you wouldn't have, a 2-foot spear or something. It wouldn't make any sense. You'd have, for the thing to actually fly, you'd have to have a certain length of a spear and probably a counterweight and so on. So these guys have a website called Goliathspear.com. So I figured if anybody knows anything about Goliath's spear, maybe the guy that made the website called Goliathspear.com might have some knowledge of this. And it seemed to make some sense to me, though it's not scripture. But anyway, they said there, based off the looms used in that time period, it would be common for a weaver's beam to be 2 to 2.5 inches thick and more than 5 feet long. So that would have been, a regular weaver's beam. So, pretty good sized rod there. Then the article continues. It says, for the physics of our Goliath spear beam to work properly with a 16-pound, 11-ounce spearhead, and I'll talk about the spearhead next. I think that's an accurate weight for the spearhead, because when you calculate it out, that number's about right in the middle of the upper and lower bounds of what the spearhead would weigh, depending on which shekel you used. So anyway, for the physics of our Goliath's spear beam to work properly with a 16-pound, 11-ounce spearhead and the height of Goliath, we choose a 10-foot length, 2-inch diameter pole using a 6-pound, 1.2-ounce counterweight, giving our spear a total length of 12 feet 7 inches. This is not to say the spear could not have been even longer. The Bible doesn't give us the exact length. However, the length we calculated for our replica would allow Goliath to have a center of balance to hold the spear easily with one hand, about 62 inches from the tip. This would allow him to thrust it directly at the enemy to achieve the best leverage and killing force. So a 12-foot spear with this giant spearhead on it, which we'll look at the spearhead now. There in the rest of verse 7, it says, this is 1 Samuel 17:7, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. 600 shekels of iron. Now, according to the definition of the shekel from the OED, which I just gave you here a minute ago, that would have made Goliath's spear weigh about 10 pounds. Okay? Spear head, that is, not the spear, just the spear head, 10 pounds. You've probably, well, you ladies might not have, but you men have probably swung a 10-pound sledgehammer, haven't you? Like a full-size sledgehammer. Pretty heavy. Well, that would have been the weight of the head of Goliath's spear. Now, if you use the definition of the shekel from Unger's Bible Dictionary, which we looked at before already, that would have made Goliath's spear his spear head may weigh 20.6 pounds. Now that's a pretty heavy spearhead there, 20 pounds. So depending on the weight of the shekel, he had a spearhead that weighed somewhere between 10 and 20.6 pounds. And these guys here at GoliathSpear.com thought it was 16 point something, which, that makes pretty good sense, doesn't it? That's right between the 10 and the 20, a little closer to the 20. Now, this is just the head. The whole spear, I'm guessing, would have probably weighed between 20 and 30 pounds because you had this long 10-foot wooden rod, 2 inches thick, and then you had a counterweight on the back of it probably, because if you didn't have a counterweight, it wouldn't fly correctly. So when you put that all together, probably 20 to 30 pounds for this spear. So in other words, his spear weighed as much as between probably 1 and 3 sledgehammers, and he would be, hurling this thing at people. Now, if you just think about this giant, this guy that's like 10 to 12 feet tall. He's got this spear that probably weighs 20 to 30 pounds and is 12 feet long. You can imagine how hard this guy could throw. Imagine what that spear would do to you if it hit you. It'd be like getting hit with a missile or something. I mean, you'd be totally out of commission. So this guy was a formidable foe to Israel. And on top of that, he also had a servant bearing a shield in front of him. We read about that at the end of verse 7. And one bearing a shield went before him. So he's got his helmet of brass, he's got a target on his chest, he's got a coat of mail covering basically his entire upper body. He's got the, whatever those things were called, on his shins, which I already forgot. What were those called? They were called greaves. He had greaves on his shins. And then he's got this guy going before him with his great big shield to protect him. And he's got this gigantic spear. Now, you'd wonder who in the world would ever decide to fight a guy like that. Well, David was a special guy. So Goliath is taunting Israel and challenging them to fight with him. This is typical of big bullies. The big kids in school, the big 6th grader loves to throw the kindergartners around and pick on them because that's what bullies do. The great big guys like to pick on the little guys. You never notice how the big guys don't pick on the big guys or the bigger guys? Right? They like to pick on the little guys, right? This is what Goliath was doing. In verses 8 through 10. 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 10. That's why I recommend people carry a firearm with you, because that is the great equalizer. If I got a 9-foot tall guy coming after me, as long as he's more than about 20 feet away, I'm not really too worried about it because I've got an equalizer with me. I guess if he was 9 feet tall, I might have to shoot several times. But anyway, that does level out the playing field just a little bit. So, especially for women. Women don't have a chance against the average man. It's just a fact. Right? Women are not as strong as the average man. So that's why I think it's a good idea for women to conceal carry too. It is the great equalizer. You can make that guy take the room temperature challenge, as John Correa says. Anyway, verses 8 through 10. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man from you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then ye shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. How brave of this 10-foot to 12-foot tall giant. Hey, just come on down. You beat me, we're going to be your servants. I beat you, you're going to be ours. Well, like Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. So Goliath had a plan, but it wasn't going to work out too well for him. But we'll get to that next week, Lord willing. So Saul and all Israel were dismayed and greatly afraid of the giant. 1 Samuel 17:11. It says, And Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. You see, modern warfare has changed, because today, if you had some 10-foot tall dude standing out in a field and saying, "Hey, come get me," okay, bang, you're dead. Send a missile out there or whatever. So, but warfare is different. Back in those days, it was close up and personal. You weren't even going to fire arrows and hurt this guy. I mean, this coat of mail would probably have defended him against arrows and things like that. So it was going to be one-on-one actual man fighting back in those days. And they were afraid. Dismayed means overwhelmed with fear or appalled. Fear this is the Old English, which is prior to the King James. You're talking like back in the 11 to 1300 or something like that. It meant a sudden or terrible event, peril. But the definition that is used in the King James, in modern English, which is King James English, is the emotion of pain or uneasiness caused by the sense of impending danger or by the prospect of some possible evil. And then it goes on to say, now the general term for all degrees of the emotion, in early use applied to its more violent extremes, now denoted by alarm, terror, fright, or dread. So they were terrified. They were dreading this giant. They were afraid, obviously. Afraid means alarmed, frightened. Hence, as an adjective, it's in a state of fear or apprehension, moved or actuated by fear. And it said that they were greatly afraid. Greatly is to a great extent, in a great degree, extensively, exceedingly, highly, much, very. So these guys were shaking in their boots. They were extremely afraid. They were terrified. And, I can see why they would have been afraid by a big guy like this. Well, David went out to bring food to his brothers that were in the army. David was the youngest of his siblings. I think there were 7 or 8 of them. I can't remember if it was 7 or 8. Anyway, and he was left with the sheep. His father told him to go out and take bread and take some food to his brothers who were fighting with the Philistines. And David came and he saw Goliath defying the armies of Israel, and David was indignant. David was not having any of this. This is why sometimes, people say, and there's truth in this, they say that, that young men a lot of times have more valor and they're less cautious and they're more zealous. Sometimes they're overly zealous. And that's true. That does happen with young people. And as you get older, you'll moderate and so on. And that's true, you do. But sometimes the zealousness of youth is good. Sometimes young people in their zeal put old people to shame because old people get tired and lazy and they just don't want to deal with stuff. They don't want to fight the battles anymore. And the young still plow in there with vigor and energy. This is what happened with David. So it's good to have both young and old in society, in a church, because you do get a balance. You get the cautiousness of older people that have seen how things work sometimes and realize the pitfalls of just jumping in there headlong. But then you also have the younger people that are willing to just spearhead it and get it done. Let's do something. Let's make something happen here. This is what David was going to do. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 26. It says, And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? And who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David wants to know, first of all, what's the reward to the guy that kills this guy? And secondly, who does this Goliath guy think he is? Defying the armies of the living God? Are you kidding me? What are we standing around for? What are you guys waiting for? David's like, let's kill this guy. I like David's attitude. So David goes before Saul and he volunteers to fight Goliath. David, this is a little kid. He's just passing into adulthood. He's probably 17 years old or something like that. He's still a kid. He's like, I'll fight him. What are you guys worried about? 1 Samuel 17 and verse 32. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Can you imagine? Here are all these full-grown men, probably in their early to mid-20s, I suppose, military-aged men, big, burly, tough guys. And here's little David comes out to bring some food to his brothers, 16, 17 years old, something like that. And all these guys are cowering in fear. And David's like, what are you guys afraid of? Let's do it. I'll kill him. I'll do it. He wasn't afraid. David didn't have a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So he volunteers to fight there in verse 32. It says, I'll go fight this Philistine. Now Saul scoffed. Got those two mixed up there a little bit. Saul scoffed at the idea of David fighting Goliath because he was a youth. You know what Saul's doing here? Despising David's youth. So you can't fight that guy. You're a kid. He's a giant. Verse 33. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. You can't do this. He's putting him down. And he's belittling him. You're just a kid. You can't do that. Who do you think you are? His brothers accused him of pride. It's interesting when somebody, I didn't read that verse here, but they accused him of pride. They say, I know thy pride. It's interesting, sometimes when somebody's going to step forward and go out on a limb and they're going to do something because they know it's the right thing to do, and the people that won't do it themselves, will then condemn the guy that's going to do the right thing and accuse him of pride or accuse him of something else. I found it interesting, this is just a side note, when I got rid of my smartphone, I sent everybody that I texted with for like the last 6 months, sent everybody a text saying, hey, I'm getting rid of my smartphone, I'm going to have a flip phone, no texting anymore. And it was just interesting, the responses that I got. Some people didn't respond at all, which is fine. I did get some response. Some were just, okay, no problem, thanks for letting me know. Some people were like, I really respect that decision. They're not going to do it themselves, but I respect that decision, and I commend you for that. But then there's some other people, not very many, there's some other people that are like, why are you going to do that? What are you going to do for GPS? What are you going to do for navigation? What are you going to do? Just like, have you thought this through? This is foolish, blah, 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 blah. You know what it was? The person wasn't concerned about my well-being and that I might get lost. Because, as if men haven't navigated this earth for the last 6,000 years without a dang iPhone. It wasn't that this person was concerned about my well-being. You know what this person was concerned about? Why this person, I'm not going to give you the gender, why this person was upset and irritated that I was getting rid of my iPhone? Because this person knew that person could not give up his or hers. That's why this person was so indignant about me getting rid of mine, because he or she knew that he or she could not and would not give up he or she's, because he or she was addicted to it and couldn't possibly give it up. So what do you have to do? You have to make me look like an idiot and me look crazy and say, are you crazy? Why would you do this? Why would you go back to living the way that mankind lived a mere 10 years ago and prior to that for all of human history? You're crazy. You're nuts. That's why people respond like that, because they feel convicted. They wouldn't do what you're going to do. Therefore, you have to be nuts. You have to be crazy. That's human nature. So I found that interesting. That's what David's brothers did when they accused him of pride. They weren't going to go fight Goliath. I think they accused him of pride even before he said he was going to fight Goliath, when he came out to see the battle. I think that's when they accused him of pride. But the point is, his brothers weren't going to fight Goliath. And they would look down on David. Saul was a big guy, right? He was head and shoulders above the crowd. He wasn't going to go fight Goliath. He's got to look down on David, say, you're but a youth. You can't do that. There's a verse that comes to mind here. The Pharisees. They wouldn't let other people go into the kingdom of God. They would speak evil of the publicans and harlots that were going into the kingdom of God. They themselves wouldn't go in. Right? So they're not going to do it they're going to speak evil of people that are. Saul said David was a youth. A youth is the fact or state of being young, youngness, often blending into sense, or blending with sense too. Number 2 is the time when one is young, the early part or period of life, more specifically, the period from puberty till the attainment of full growth between childhood and adult age. So you have this period between childhood and adulthood. So adolescence, in other words. So David was still an adolescent. He wasn't of full adult age yet. That's why I said probably 16, 17, could have been 15. Who knows how old he was. And by the way, the thing that I just said there, it was no member or visitor of this church that said that to me. I was being vague because I didn't want you to maybe figure out who I was talking about. Not that you probably would have anyway, but it wasn't any member of this church, so don't worry about that. But anyway, so David was said to be a stripling. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 56. It says, "And the king said, Inquire thou whose son the stripling is." This was after. Saul wants to know, whose kid is this after he killed Goliath? Now, a stripling will give us a little more information about David. A stripling is a youth, one just passing from boyhood to manhood. So like I said, a teenager, in other words, probably a middle to late teenager. But David was not going to let Saul despise his youth. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. First Timothy 4:12, Paul says, "Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity." That young preacher was not to let anybody despise his youth. Why would Paul tell him that? Because older people were going to despise his youth, that's why. They're going to say, "Oh, well, you're just a kid. You don't know. Right? You haven't been where I've been. You haven't experienced what I've been. You're just a kid. You're young enough to be my kid. You're young enough to be my grandkid." And they would poo-poo him. And you know what Paul tells Timothy? You don't let people do that. You're a young preacher, and you got somebody that's going to belittle you and look down on you because you're young. "Oh, you're young enough to be my kid. Oh, I don't need to hear what you have to say." You know what you do? You don't let them. You rebuke that. Say, "Don't you despise my youth. God put me in this office. God apparently thought I was old enough to do it. The Holy Ghost made me an overseer. Don't despise my youth." Now, of course, you also want to be humble and realize that you are young and you do have a lot to learn, and wisdom does come with age. So obviously, you don't want to be haughty and arrogant when you tell people not to despise your youth, but you don't want to let them despise your youth either. You should have a mixture there of leadership and humility, of strength and humility. So David made his case to Saul why he was qualified to fight the giant based on his past experience. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 34. Now, David didn't have experience as a warrior, as a soldier. He'd never fought in battle before. But David did have experience. David could point to other things in his life that he had done which qualified him to fight this giant, even though he had actually never done it. I mean, isn't that the case with pretty much all of life? Anytime you set out to do something new, you've never done it before, right? So if you would never trust anybody to do something that they've never done before, well, nobody would ever get any experience and do anything. If somebody wouldn't call a preacher because he's a young man, because he's never preached before, nobody'd ever be a preacher, because nobody's ever preached before the first time they started, right? Well, same thing with David here. He points back to his previous experience that was similar but not identical, and he was convinced that that gave him enough that he could do it. 1 Samuel 17, 34 through 35, "And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Now that is something, I got to say. He went after that bear and that lion and caught him by his beard and killed him. And I don't think David's lying here. I think David's telling the truth. Now, I don't know about you. How many of you would go after a lion or a bear that took one of the lambs of the flock and kill him with your bare hands or your slingshot or whatever you have? You know, we're not talking about a 100-yard shot here with your 30-06. We're talking about hand-to-hand combat with a bear or with a lion. And a kid at that, a teenager. I mean, if a kid told me that and I actually believed that he did it, go ahead. You want to fight Goliath? Go ahead. I mean, if you can fight a bear and a lion, you go ahead and fight Goliath. David reasoned that since God had delivered him out of the paws of the lion and the bear, that he would deliver him out of the hand of Goliath. That's pretty good reasoning. Verses 36 and 37. He said, Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. And David said, Moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. David was acting on faith. David said, The Lord delivered me before, and he delivered me from some great adversaries, a lion and a bear. He'll deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine too. He trusted that based on God's previous deliverance, that he would deliver him yet again. Look at 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. And this is what we all need to remember. Think about all the deliverances that we've been studying for the last several weeks here, and think about all the times that God saved his people, and then think, well, if he did it before, if he did it then, he can do it to me, he can do it now. And think about the deliverance in your own lives. He delivered me from this or that or the other thing. If he delivered me from those things, he can deliver me again. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. It says, Who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. Past, present, and future deliverance. It says, Who delivered us in the past from so great a death, and doth deliver. He's delivering us right now, and we trust that he'll yet deliver us. This is exactly David's attitude. And Paul likewise concluded that because God had delivered him in the past, he would deliver him in the future from every evil work. And you know, interestingly enough, you know what God delivered Paul from in the past? The mouth of a lion. Just like David. I'll show it to you. 2 Timothy 4, 17 through 18. This is really interesting. 2 Timothy 4, 17 and 18. Paul says, Notwithstanding, the Lord stood by me. He just said, all men forsook me. At his first answer, no men stood with him. All men forsook him. But the Lord stood with him. He says, Notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Isn't that interesting? Paul was delivered from the mouth of a lion. Now, could it have been an actual physical lion? Yeah, the Christians were thrown to lions in Rome, so Paul could have been delivered from the mouth of a physical lion. But what is Satan called? A roaring lion that walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Paul was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Whether it was an animal, or whether it was a man acting like an animal, like Nero or somebody like that, or whether it was the devil himself, Paul was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And look what he says in verse 18. And the Lord shall deliver me from every evil work, and will preserve me unto his heavenly kingdom, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul concluded just like David did. The Lord saved me out of the mouth of the lion, and he's going to deliver me from every evil work. This is what David thought. And this is a principle that Israel should have been familiar with. Look at Deuteronomy 1 and verse 30. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 30. Deuteronomy 1:30, the Lord your God, which goeth before you, he shall fight for you, according to all that he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. When you go into that promised land, he's going to fight for you according to, agreeing, corresponding, or matching to what he did to you in Egypt. He saved you out of Egypt by his mighty hand. He's going to save you when you go in and you war against the Canaanites, the Lord's saying. The Lord's telling you that I've done it before, I'll do it again. David reasoned the same thing. The Lord did it before, he'll do it again. This Philistine is no match for me because God is with me. And if God is with me, who can be against me? So Saul gave David permission to fight the Philistine, and he gave him armor, a helmet, a coat of mail, and a sword. But David put them off because he had not proved them. 1 Samuel 17, verses 38 through 39. It is a shame that I'm going to have to stop here and pick up for the remainder of this story next Sunday because it is such a fascinating account here, but I'm obviously not going to be able to preach for another hour. 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 39. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. Now this was Saul's armor. Saul was a big man, head and shoulders, literally head and shoulders above the rest. And he puts on his helmet and his coat of mail and all this stuff. And you can just imagine David, this little kid, teenage kid, and he's got all this great big helmet on, probably falling down above his eyes or something. His coat of mail is down to his knees, and he hadn't proved it. He doesn't, even if it fit him, he still said, I didn't prove it. And David's like, you know what, I'm not going to use this stuff. This is silly. God delivered me out of the bear of the mouth of the lion, out of the mouth of the bear and the lion. I didn't have mail on. I didn't have a helmet on. I didn't have anything. I just went up, grabbed that sucker by the beard, and killed him. I don't need this stuff. So he puts it off because he hadn't proved it. Now this was wise for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because the Bible tells us that we should prove all things before we hold fast to them. Ephesians 5 and verse 10. Ephesians 5 and verse 10. Proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. So we need to prove things that are acceptable to the Lord before we accept them ourselves. And of course we have 1 Thessalonians 5:21. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Remember that verse. That's a good one to hold on to. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. The Bible tells us that the simple believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his going. Don't hold on. Don't believe everything you hear. You got to prove it. You got to test it. Make sure it's valid, legitimate, and truthful. And then you hold on to it. I think of just maybe a practical example of this in our time. Imagine if I ended up being arrested for holding church. If there's another lockdown or something, I end up being arrested. And I get called into court. And some lawyer says, hey, take all this stuff. Here's all these constitutional arguments. Here's here's some case law. Here's this and that. All these legal arguments. Just study up on this stuff. You give them this. You're going to win this case, no problem. And you know what I'd say? Nah, I haven't proved this stuff. Throw it away. You know what I'm taking with me? Right here. This is what I take with me to court. This is why. This is what I use to explain to them why we're meeting. Not because of the Constitution, not because of the Bill of Rights, not because of any of that stuff. Because of what God says. You go into court with this book, and guess what? What do they have to argue against? This book. Those fools don't know a thing about this book. They're not going to be able to argue with this book. And even if they try to argue with it, there is no wisdom, nor might, nor counsel against the Lord. You're not going to win. Now you go there and make constitutional arguments, good luck. They've got their hired guns. They've got guys that could run circles around you and all of their pseudo-logic and court cases that say the Constitution doesn't mean what it says and all those kind of things. You stick with the book. At least if it's a matter of religion. I mean, if you're in prison because you didn't pay your property tax or something, well, good luck, whatever. Get a lawyer. But if you're going to prison or jail or something, or court, because of church stuff, because of religious stuff, you stick to the Bible. Now, this was a wise idea on David's case for putting off that armor and just going to battle, trusting the Lord to take care of you, because we are not to rely on our weapons for protection, but on God's help and protection. I'm just going to give you a slew of verses here. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 47. 1 Samuel 17, 47. David said, and all this assembly shall know, this is David speaking, that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So David recognizes that the Lord doesn't save by sword and spear. He doesn't save by our weapons, by our ideas, by our strength. The Lord saves by himself. He likes to save people that don't have all the weapons and all the strength and all the power. His strength is made perfect in weakness. That's how God likes to do it. Look at Psalm 20 and verse 7. Psalm 20 and verse 7. I have a whole ton of verses here. I'm just going to rattle them off just to show you the ubiquitousness of this point, that we should not trust in our weapons for protection. Now, that's not to say that we should be fools either, right? God does expect you to protect yourself. Jesus said, a strong man armed keepeth his palace. When he does so, his goods are in peace. You should be armed. You should have weapons at home. They should be loaded. They should be accessible. Let me tell you what, a gun in a gun safe is as useless as a spitball against an invader. A gun in a gun safe is absolutely worthless when it comes to, or a gun that's unloaded, sitting in the corner. You may as well have a baseball bat sitting there. You might be able to take that gun and throw it at a criminal, or try to, if it's a rifle, to swing it at him. If it is unloaded, it is absolutely worthless for home defense. This is just my thing. I mean, take it or leave it, but I think everybody should have a loaded weapon in their house, very quickly accessible, that when you hear the door crash down at night, you can grab that thing immediately and defend yourself. You're trying to grab it and find the ammo and unlock the safe and all that stuff. Good luck. You may as well just walk out there and say, I surrender. Please don't kill me. You'd be way better off. Psalm 20 and verse 7. I'm in Proverbs 20. Psalm 20 and verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. See, some trust in the military for their protection. There's a lot of people, in our country, they trust in the military. They think we have the most powerful military in the world, and nothing's ever going to happen to us. Well, that's debatable, whether we have the most powerful and the most advanced technologically military in the world. Russia and China are making some pretty impressive hypersonic weapons and all kinds of stuff. And you know what happens to big empires? They get big and fat and slow and bloated, and a lot of our technology is decades old. A lot of the planes that we're flying, the planes that actually still work, this F-35 boondoggle, this thing's a piece of junk. Spent over $1 trillion on it. But a lot of the planes that we're flying are old. I mean, they're like back in the 90s or something. So we think that, nothing could ever stand up to our military. Well, don't be so haughty and arrogant to think that nobody could ever stand up to us. The generals are always fighting the last war. That's how it works. They're always preparing to fight the war like the last one. The next war would be quite different if it was actually a real war. When you got hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles coming in, all your M1 Abrams tanks are totally worthless, right? I mean, in the kind of modern warfare that we're looking at, hopefully that never happens, that kind of stuff, you may as well just wave the white flag and hopefully they'll be nice to you whenever they conquer you, because that ain't going to work. Psalm 33, 16 through 19. We don't want to trust in chariots and horses is the point. We want to remember the name of the Lord our God. Psalm 33, 16 through 19. It says, "There is no king saved by the multitude of an host. A mighty man is not delivered by much strength. An horse is a vain thing for safety. Neither shall he deliver any by his great strength. Behold, the eye of the Lord is upon them that fear him, upon them that hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine." Don't rely on the multitude of the host. That's the military. Don't rely on our much strength. Don't rely on the horse, right? The horse is the modern day equivalent of the tank or the airplane or whatever. We don't rely on those things. If you want to put your confidence in something, you put it in the Lord God, you fear God, you humbly submit to Him, and you pray to God that He protects us. And that's a lot better defense than relying in the military, or when it comes to personally relying on your own defensive arms. Everybody knows, I think everybody knows, that I carry a concealed weapon with me all the time. I don't rely on it though. And sometimes I'll go out without it. Or when I go on vacation a lot of times, I can't, if I have to drive through Illinois or something, it gets locked in the trunk because I don't want to end up in jail on some technicality. And you know what? I'm not afraid when I'm driving, when I don't have it with me, or if I had to fly, like when I've had to fly to go home or something, I don't take it with me, and I'm gone however long I'm gone, and I don't have it. I'm not afraid. I'm not worried about it. But when I can carry it, I carry it. And that's the way you should be. You should be prepared. Horses prepared against the day of battle, but safety's of the Lord. You always want to remember that your trust and your confidence needs to be in the Lord, not in your weapons. But be prepared. Just like having a fire extinguisher in the house, right? You should have a fire extinguisher. Now, you shouldn't be trusting in that thing, saying, well, my house is never going to burn down because I have a fire extinguisher. But it's a good thing to have one, isn't it? Car insurance, locks on your doors in your house, anything. There's all kinds of things like that. Prepare, but then trust in the Lord. Psalm 44, 6 through 7. Psalm 44, 6 through 7. It says, "For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, and hast put them to shame that hated us." This is what David's attitude was. He wasn't going to trust in his bow and his sword for safety. Saul gave him his sword, and David gave it back. I'm not going to trust in this. I'm going to trust in the Lord. I've got my slingshot. I've got my 5 stones. That's all I need. You can imagine, we'll get to that one next week, but you can imagine Saul saying, okay, all right, we'll see how that goes for you with your slingshot going up against 10-foot Goliath. I think I already quoted this one, Proverbs 21:31. Proverbs 21:31. "The horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord." So when you put all these verses together, then you start to see the big picture. Don't trust in a horse for safety, the Psalms tell us, but then it says the horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. Right? So have the horse, get it prepared, get it ready for the battle, but you trust in the Lord, not in the horse, you see? I think it all makes pretty good sense, doesn't it? Look at 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 15. 2 Chronicles 13, 15. Like I've told you before, get some supply of dried food or something set up in your house just in case. You don't trust in that food, but you have it there just in case, right? prepare the horse against the day of battle and then pray to God you never have to eat that food. I pray to God that mine all goes bad. Because it's 25 years. I mean, I hope in 25 years from now, that stuff's bred worms and I got to throw it away. That means I never had to eat it. That means I was never short on food or money or something like that. 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 15. But knowing me, I'm such a tightwad. Come year 24, we're going to start eating that stuff because I don't want to throw it away. I spent too much money on it. 2 Chronicles 13:15. That'd be a good thing I could give to you guys for birthday presents or something. I'll give you a little bit of dried food here in 24 years from now. Or better yet, just have you over for dinner. What are we having for dinner? Oh, you're going to love it. This meal has been in the works for 25 years. We've been planning this thing for a long time. It's going to be wonderful. 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 15. It says, Then the men of Judah gave a shout, and as the men of Judah shouted, it came to pass that God smote Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. And the children of Israel fled before Judah, and God delivered them into their hand. And then down in verse 18, Thus the children of Israel were brought under at that time. See, Israel and Judah were fighting. Israel were the villains in this case. The children of Israel were brought under at that time, and the children of Judah prevailed because they relied upon the Lord God of their fathers. They relied upon God. Their horse was prepared against the day of battle, but they trusted that safety was of the Lord. Look at 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 15. Just got a couple of more here and we'll be done. 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 15. And he said, Hearken ye, all Judah, and ye inhabitants of Jerusalem, and thou King Jehoshaphat, Thus saith the Lord unto you, Be not afraid nor dismayed by reason of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle is God's. David's battle was God's. David trusted that the Lord would deliver that Philistine into his hand by his little slingshot and his 5 stones. And as a matter of fact, he could have, I don't know why he didn't. I don't know why he just didn't take 1 stone. I know why. Because the horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. David didn't just take 1 stone, he took 5, because you never know, you might need 5. You might need to hit him more than once. But it only took 1. We'll get to that next time. The battle's not yours, but God's. And woe unto us when we go someplace else for safety, when we trust in something else for safety. Isaiah 31 and verse 1. Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses, and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong, but they look